Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. The small village of Ainsworth had always been a quiet place. Nestled between thick forests and mist-covered hills, the village was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. The days were slow, and the nights were peaceful, except for that one time of year when the traveling shows came through. It wasn't often, but once or twice a year, a mysterious troupe would set up in the village square. They were never advertised, and no one really knew where they came from. The tents would appear overnight, strange figures setting up in the shadows before the first light of dawn. The villagers were used to the unusual nature of these visitors, and though they never stayed long, they always brought with them a certain excitement. People from nearby towns would travel to Ainsworth just to see the shows. This year, however, was different. The circus arrived just as the last remnants of autumn leaves clung to the trees. A mist hung in the air, colder than usual for the time of year, and the sky was perpetually overcast. It wasn't long before the villagers noticed something odd about the new troupe that had set up. The tents were darker than usual, black and red striped fabric that seemed to swallow the light. There were no sounds of laughter or joy, only the low murmur of whispers as people gathered in front of the entrance. Inside, the air felt heavy, as if something unseen was watching. The puppets, which were always a part of the shows, were different this time. No one could put a finger on it, but there was something unsettling about them. Their eyes were too lifelike, their movements too real. For a few days, no one dared to enter the theater. The idea of watching a puppet show seemed childish, and the strange atmosphere that clung to the tents only made it worse. But then, one evening, a group of curious villagers decided to attend the performance. It was a young woman named Mary who spoke first. She was a waitress at the local inn and had heard rumors about the troupe before. "I heard their shows are incredible," she said, her voice tinged with both excitement and hesitation. "We should go. It'll be something to remember." Her friends looked at each other, unsure, but curiosity won out. After a few moments of hesitation, they made their way to the theater's entrance, the heavy fabric swaying as they pushed through. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old wood and dust. The dim light from candles flickered on the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The stage was set with an elaborate backdrop, a castle, a forest, and what appeared to be an ancient village scene. But it was the puppets themselves that caught their attention. There were rows of them, placed carefully on wooden shelves around the room. Some stood frozen, others were half lifeless, as if they were mid-motion. The puppets were not the usual, simple wooden figures. They were dressed in finely stitched clothes, their faces painted with incredible detail, their eyes seemingly following the villagers as they walked in. One of the puppets, a young girl dressed in a tattered dress, seemed to move her head as they passed by, her empty eyes locked onto them. Mary shuddered, a chill running down her spine. "Are we sure about this?" one of her friends whispered. The air seemed colder the further they stepped into the theater. But the show was about to start. A bell rang softly, signaling the beginning of the performance. The villagers took their seats, unsure of what they were about to witness. The curtains parted, revealing the puppet stage. It was set with an elaborate scene, a grand feast in a royal hall, with the king and queen seated at the head of the table. The puppets moved as if alive, their expressions vivid, their actions smooth and graceful. But something was wrong. The puppets did not behave like inanimate objects. They moved with purpose, with intention. It was as if they were aware of the audience. The queen's puppet smiled at Mary, a slow, chilling grin that sent a shiver through her body. The king's puppet, though silent, seemed to lock eyes with her as well. "Are they alive?" someone whispered, their voice trembling. Mary couldn't answer. She was transfixed by the puppets, her gaze unable to leave the stage. The performance continued with unsettling precision, each puppet movement more lifelike than the last. The queen reached out with a delicate hand to pour wine for the king, and when she did, the liquid flowed unnaturally. It wasn't wine. It was a deep, dark red that looked more like blood than any drink Mary had ever seen. "Why are they doing this?" one of the villagers asked, their voice tight with fear. Suddenly, the stage darkened. A new figure appeared, a shadowy, towering puppet with dark robes that billowed like smoke. It was massive, its face hidden beneath a dark hood. It stood motionless for a long moment, and then, as if it had been waiting for something, it raised its hand and pointed directly at the audience. The room seemed to freeze in terror. The lights flickered as a voice, not from any puppet, but from deep within the theater itself, echoed through the room. It was a low, raspy whisper that seemed to reverberate in their minds. "One of you must join the show," the voice crooned, its words sending an icy cold shiver down their spines. "You will be our new puppet." The villagers gasped in shock. Panic set in. No one moved for a moment, until a young man in the front row stood up, shaking. His legs wobbled as if he had lost all control. "I don't want to be a puppet," he cried, his voice frantic. The towering figure turned, and in that moment, the audience realized the puppet was not just a puppet. It was real. It stepped forward, its dark robes sweeping across the floor as it approached the young man. With a sudden jerking movement, it seized him, dragging him toward the stage. "Stop!" Mary shouted, leaping from her seat, but it was too late. The young man was pulled into the shadows, vanishing from sight. A moment of silence passed, broken only by the faintest sound of wood scraping against stone. Then, the figure returned, its hands empty. But the young man was gone. Where is he?" another villager whispered, but no one could answer. The puppets on stage shifted, their faces locked in eerie smiles, their eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. The king's puppet lifted its hand, and slowly, its fingers curled into a fist. "We are the chosen," it said, its voice deep and guttural. "And you will join us." Mary's heart raced. She had seen enough. The fear in her chest rose like a storm, and she ran for the exit, her friends following behind her. As they reached the door, the sounds of laughter filled the theater, but it was not the sound of joy. It was twisted, mocking, like the laughter of something ancient and cruel. The door slammed shut behind them, and they stumbled into the village square, gasping for breath. The puppet theater was still standing, its eerie lights flickering in the distance. No one had left. No one had escaped. And as they stood there, staring at the darkened tents, they realized the truth. Those who had entered the theater would never leave. They would become part of the show, their bodies turned into lifeless puppets, their souls trapped forever in the twisted world of the puppet theater. And somewhere, deep in the darkness of the stage, the puppets waited, alive and hungry for more. The villagers stood frozen, the sounds of laughter still echoing in their ears, a cruel reminder of the nightmare they had just witnessed. The mist seemed to grow thicker around them, shrouding the square in an unnatural cold. The puppet theater loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the faint glow of the street lamps, the canvas flapping in the wind like the wings of some enormous, predatory bird. Mary's heart pounded in her chest, and she couldn't stop shaking. The image of the towering figure, dragging the young man into the shadows, played over and over in her mind. The others were equally terrified, their eyes wide, breaths shallow. No one knew what to do. No one knew how to escape. What just happened?" one of the villagers whispered, her voice trembling. She was a middle-aged woman, known for her calm demeanor, but now her hands were shaking uncontrollably. Mary took a shaky breath, trying to steady her nerves. "We need to get out of here. Now." Her voice cracked, and she realized she wasn't sure where here even was anymore. As they turned to leave, Mary caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. The street lamps flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the ground. She looked back at the puppet theater, and for a split second, she saw a face at the entrance. It was pale, lifeless, with hollow eyes that stared right into her soul. She gasped and stumbled back. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The others turned, their gazes following hers. At first, they saw nothing, just the empty expanse of the village square. But then, as the wind shifted, the silhouette of a figure emerged from the shadow of the theater. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothing, his face obscured by a hood. Mary's breath caught in her throat. Who is that?" she whispered, taking a step backward. The figure took a step forward, and the group tensed, ready to run. But then, without warning, the man lifted his head, revealing his face. It was not a man at all. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his skull, his eyes black voids with no white to them. His lips were cracked, as if they had been sewn shut and torn open again. The villagers gasped, taking a step back. Don't go near him," one of them said, her voice filled with dread. The figure raised a hand, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The mist thickened around them, and the temperature dropped even further. The air grew heavy, suffocating. It felt like the whole world was pressing in, closing in on them. The man, if he could still be called that, spoke. His voice was a deep, guttural growl, like the sound of something ancient and forgotten. "The show has just begun." The words hit them like a physical blow, and before anyone could react, the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift. The village square trembled, as if the very earth was alive and breathing beneath them. The streets began to twist, the buildings warping and distorting in the flickering light. The mist rolled over the edges of the village, swallowing everything in its path. "Run!" Mary shouted, her voice breaking through the paralysis that had gripped the others. But it was too late. The village around them was no longer the village they had known. The paths had changed, the landmarks were gone, and the once familiar streets now seemed like an endless maze of dark alleyways and shifting shadows. "We're trapped," one of the villagers muttered, his voice barely audible. The figure, no longer a man but something else entirely, began to walk toward them, his feet silent on the cobblestone. As he moved, his body seemed to stretch and distort unnaturally, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. His arms elongated, and his head tilted at an impossible angle. The air around him seemed to shimmer, warping the very fabric of reality. Mary turned and ran, pulling her friends behind her. The others followed, but their steps were slow, as if the world itself was dragging them back. The village had become a labyrinth, a nightmare of twisting streets and darkened corners. They were being hunted, and there was nowhere to hide. As they ran, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them, slow, deliberate, and rhythmic. The villagers looked over their shoulders, but saw nothing. Yet they could feel it, the presence of something following them, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Keep going," Mary cried, but her voice was filled with panic. Her breath was ragged, and her legs ached. She could hear the sound of whispers, faint and distant at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was as if the very walls of the village were speaking to her, urging her to stop. "You can't escape," the voice whispered in her ear, and she spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no one there. The whispers continued, louder now, echoing in her mind. They were coming from everywhere, from the ground beneath her feet, from the air around her. The village itself was alive with them, mocking her, taunting her, telling her that it was too late. "You are ours." Mary's heart raced. She could hear the others behind her, but their footsteps were uneven, as if they too were being pulled by some invisible force. She glanced over her shoulder again, and this time she saw it. The figure, its face twisted and contorted into something that should not be human, was standing at the end of the street, watching them with its black eyes. The others screamed, but there was no time to flee. The village had swallowed them whole. With a sudden, deafening crack, the ground beneath their feet split open, revealing a pit of darkness. The streets fell away, the buildings crumbled, and the entire village seemed to collapse into itself. And then, in the blink of an eye, the world went dark. When the villagers awoke, they found themselves in a place they couldn't recognize. The sky was no longer blue, but a deep, blood-red hue. The air smelled like decay, and the ground was slick and wet beneath their feet. They were no longer in Ainsworth. They were somewhere else, a place that felt wrong, twisted, and foreign. In the distance, the puppet theater loomed, but now it was different. It had grown larger, taller, its walls cracked and decayed, its once bright colors now faded and tarnished. The air around it was thick with the stench of rot. The figure was waiting for them. "You are ours," it said again, its voice like the sound of bones breaking. And then the puppets appeared. They crawled out from the shadows, their movements jerky and unnatural, their lifeless eyes staring into the villagers' souls. Some were dressed in the clothes of the villagers, tattered, stained, and torn. Others were dressed in strange, archaic garments, their faces frozen in grotesque expressions. Mary's blood ran cold as she realized the truth. The puppets weren't just puppets. They were the remains of the audience, of those who had come before them, those who had disappeared, never to return. And now they were part of the show. The figure raised its hand, and the puppets began to move, their wooden joints creaking and snapping as they slowly approached the group. "No, no, please," Mary whispered, her voice breaking. But it was too late. The puppets were upon them. The show had truly begun. The air around Mary grew colder still, as if the very essence of the world was being drained away. The villagers stumbled backward, their movements slow and stiff, as if the weight of the unseen force pressing against them was growing unbearable. The whispers from before had returned, louder now, echoing in their minds like 1,000 voices, all speaking at once. "You cannot escape." The figure, its eyes hollow and black, moved closer. Its lips twisted into a smile that sent a chill through Mary's entire body. The others were frozen, their faces pale with terror, their limbs trembling. It wasn't just the darkness that had overtaken them. No, something far worse had taken root in this place, a force that reached into the very heart of their fear. The puppets closed in, their jerky, unnatural movements creating an almost rhythmic shuffle as they advanced. Mary couldn't breathe. She could see the twisted faces of the villagers who had vanished before, their bodies turned into grotesque imitations of life, their eyes wide and unblinking. The bodies of the missing were no longer human. They were puppets, their flesh pale and stiff, their movements devoid of life. One puppet, a man she vaguely recognized, was dressed in a torn farmer's coat. His eyes were wide, but there was nothing behind them. He reached out with stiff, wooden fingers and, in a voice that sounded as though it had been wrenched from the depths of the earth, he spoke. "Join us, it's too late to run." Mary stepped back, her feet sinking into the wet, decaying ground beneath her. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she could barely keep her balance. Panic gripped her, threatening to overwhelm her. "Please," she gasped, voice hoarse. "What do you want from us?" The figure that had been watching them moved forward, its presence dominating the scene like a shadow that consumed the very air around them. Its voice echoed again, deep and resonant, carrying an unnatural power that made the ground tremble beneath their feet. "You are here for a reason," it said, its voice full of malice. "The show is not for the living. The show is for those who are worthy." Worthy. The word twisted in the air like a curse. "We are the chosen," it continued, its head tilting as it regarded them with those black, hollow eyes. "And so are you." "No, no," Mary shouted, trying to break free of the weight of fear that clung to her. "We don't belong here. We didn't ask for this." The figure stepped closer, and its presence seemed to swallow up the last remnants of light. As it moved, the air grew even colder, the oppressive weight of its presence forcing the villagers to their knees. "You are all part of the show," the figure rasped, its lips curling into an awful, jagged smile. "You will take your place." One by one, the puppets closed in, surrounding the group, their movements jerky and unsettling. The villagers shrieked in terror, but their voices were swallowed by the thick air. No one could move. No one could escape. And then, as if the nightmare had grown bored of the terror, the figure raised a hand, halting the puppets. A cold silence settled over them, pressing down on their chests like a heavy weight. "You will see what you are meant to become," the figure intoned, its voice soft, almost coaxing. "You will understand when it is your turn, when you join us." The ground beneath them began to shift again, the earth cracking and splitting, as if the world itself was coming apart. And then, from the cracks, more figures began to emerge, more puppets. They crawled from the earth like insects, their limbs bending at odd angles, their eyes empty and unblinking. The air reeked of rot, the scent of decay and death lingering in every breath. The land itself seemed infected with the same disease that had claimed the village. Mary turned to her friends, hoping to find some glimmer of hope, some sign that they could escape this nightmare. But the look on their faces told her everything she needed to know. They were already lost. One of them, a man named Thomas, stood frozen. His eyes were wide with terror, but there was something else, something that Mary couldn't quite place. It was as though his body was no longer his own. His hand moved, almost without him thinking, reaching toward the nearest puppet. His fingers brushed the cold, wooden surface of its face, and the moment his skin made contact, something inside him seemed to snap. His eyes glazed over, and a slow, unnatural smile spread across his lips. "Thomas, no!" Mary cried, but it was too late. The puppet nearest him, a woman dressed in rags, lifted her head, and their eyes locked. She smiled, and in that moment, the world seemed to blur, as if something dark and twisted was crawling beneath the surface of everything. The puppet's wooden mouth opened, and a voice, not quite human, escaped. "Join us," the puppet said, its voice a rasping, dry whisper. Without warning, Thomas's body jerked violently, as if he was being pulled by invisible strings. His limbs stretched unnaturally, his face contorting as the transformation began. The others screamed, but no sound could reach him. The transformation was too swift. His body began to stiffen, his skin losing its color, his eyes becoming hollow and empty. In moments, he was no longer Thomas. He was a puppet. Mary's stomach churned, and she fell to her knees, her heart racing in her chest. She tried to scream, but her throat was tight with terror. She reached for her friends, but they were already losing themselves. One by one, they were taken, their bodies contorted into the grotesque shapes of the puppets. The figure that had been watching them all along approached Mary. It stopped just in front of her, its gaze so cold it felt like ice piercing through her very soul. "You will become part of the show too," the figure whispered, bending down to look into her eyes. "There is no escaping. You will be ours." Mary's breath hitched, her body trembling uncontrollably. She could feel the pull of the figure's presence, dragging her closer. The whispers filled her mind, louder now, overwhelming her thoughts. She could see the puppets around her, their hollow eyes staring, waiting. She could feel the sharp sting of their wooden hands as they reached out to claim her. But just as she felt herself slipping into the darkness, something within her snapped. With one final, desperate cry, she surged forward, shoving herself away from the figure, away from the cold, unrelenting presence. She ran, faster than she had ever run before, her feet pounding the wet ground beneath her. She could hear the others calling her name, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she was so close. She had to escape. She had to survive. But the mist had thickened, and the village, if it could still be called that, had twisted into an unrecognizable nightmare. The paths she once knew were gone, replaced by endless alleys and darkened streets. The puppet theater loomed behind her, and she could feel the weight of it, the heaviness that threatened to crush her. And then, as she turned a corner, She found herself standing in front of the entrance once again. The doors to the puppet theater were wide open, and the air inside seemed to call to her. The sound of laughter, not from the puppets, but from the audience, an audience she couldn't see, echoed out, drawing her in. Mary trembled. She didn't want to go in. She didn't want to be part of the show. But her feet moved, almost of their own accord, dragging her toward the door. The whispers returned, louder than before. "You are ours." With one final breath, Mary stepped into the theater, and the show began. As Mary crossed the threshold of the puppet theater, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash. The sound reverberated through the darkened room, and for a moment, everything fell silent. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow and rapid. She stood frozen at the entrance, her eyes adjusting to the dim light that flickered overhead. The air inside was thick with dust and the heavy scent of decay, as if the theater had been abandoned for years. Yet there was a strange, oppressive feeling, as though it had never truly been empty. The stage stretched out before her, empty, save for a single puppet standing motionless in the center. Its wooden limbs were cracked and splintered, and its face was a grotesque mask of lifeless expression. Its eyes were wide, frozen in a permanent state of shock or terror. The strings above it hung loosely, barely holding the puppet in place. But even in its stillness, the puppet seemed aware, as if it were waiting for something. Then, from the darkness at the back of the theater, came a sound. A low, rasping laugh. It wasn't human. No, it was far too deep, too hollow. The laugh echoed, filling every corner of the room, bouncing off the walls like it was coming from everywhere at once. Mary's skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. Slowly, she turned her head, and there, in the shadows at the farthest end of the theater, stood the figure. Its tall, twisted silhouette was a stark contrast against the dark backdrop. The figure's limbs were unnaturally long, stretching beyond human proportions. Its face was hidden beneath a dark hood, but even without seeing it, Mary could feel its gaze upon her, cold, calculating, and full of malice. "You came." The voice spoke again, its tone so rich with venom that it made her teeth ache. "You always do, and now you're a part of the show, just like the others." She stepped back, her body moving of its own accord, trying to distance herself from the figure. The walls seemed to close in, as if the very building was shifting, pulling her closer to the stage. She could feel the floor beneath her feet, slick with some kind of substance she couldn't identify. Her stomach turned at the thought of it, but she couldn't stop. It was as if some invisible force was guiding her forward, forcing her to obey. "You'll see what happens to those who think they can escape," the figure continued, its voice trailing off into a soft chuckle. Mary's pulse quickened, and her eyes darted around the room, searching for any means of escape. But the doors were gone. There was no way out. The theater had become a labyrinth, its walls stretching endlessly, its shadows growing deeper. She turned back toward the stage. The puppet was still there, now joined by others, more puppets, each more grotesque and lifeless than the last. Their eyes were all fixed on her, their movements frozen, as though they were waiting for her to make the first move. The air grew thick with an unbearable tension, the kind that made it feel like the walls themselves were pressing in. The laughter, that low, mocking laughter, continued to echo, swirling around her like a storm. "You don't have to be afraid," the figure said, stepping closer, its movements slow and deliberate. "All you have to do is accept your place. Accept that you are one of us now." "One of you?" Mary gasped, barely able to get the words out through the knot in her throat. "I'm nothing like you." But the figure only laughed again, its laugh so loud and jarring that it seemed to shake the very foundation of the theater. It raised a long, bony finger and pointed directly at her, its motion jerky, as though its joints were made of brittle wood. "Everything about you already belongs here, Mary. You just don't know it yet." Suddenly, the puppet on the stage jerked to life. Its head turned toward her with a snap, its eyes locking with hers. Mary stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat as the puppet began to move. It was slow at first, its limbs creaking like old wood. But soon it began to walk toward her, its movements unnaturally fluid, as though it were more than just a puppet. It was alive. As it reached the edge of the stage, it stopped, staring at her with unblinking eyes. Its mouth opened, and in a voice that was both hauntingly familiar and utterly alien, it spoke. "Join us." Mary's knees buckled, and she dropped to the floor, unable to look away. Her hands gripped the floorboards beneath her, and she fought to regain her composure. This couldn't be real. None of it could be real. She had to wake up. She had to get out of here. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape. Her body was frozen, trapped in place by some invisible force. "You have no choice," the figure intoned, its voice so close now, she could feel its breath on the back of her neck. "Once you enter the theater, there is only one path. You will become one of us." The puppets began to move again, jerking to life like marionettes on frayed strings. They clattered toward her, their faces contorted in grotesque expressions, their wooden bodies creaking with every step. She couldn't look away from them. She couldn't tear her eyes from their movements, from the way they twisted unnaturally, like something that didn't belong in the world of the living. Her heart raced, her body trembling with the weight of dread. They were getting closer now, the puppets closing in around her, their cold, empty eyes watching her every move. "No!" she cried, her voice hoarse, but it was lost in the sea of whispers that filled her mind. "I'm not like you." But the puppets were relentless. One of them reached out, its hand, a grotesque wooden claw, gripped her arm tightly, and the sharp edges of its fingers dug into her skin. She screamed in pain, but the sound was swallowed by the cacophony of laughter that filled the theater. "You are like us, Mary," the figure hissed. "We all are." And then, before she could react, another puppet grabbed her from behind, its fingers like ice, pulling her closer to the stage. Mary fought against them, her body lurching with every desperate attempt to break free. But the puppets were too strong. They were everywhere, their hands on her, pulling her in every direction, forcing her to her knees in the center of the stage. She could feel her body trembling, her heart racing, her mind screaming for freedom. But it was no use. The theater had claimed her. The figure moved closer still, its voice now a whisper, but one that echoed through the very depths of her soul. "You'll be part of the show now. Forever." Her vision blurred, her surroundings spinning as the puppets lifted her onto the stage. The world around her seemed to bend and distort, and she could feel herself being pulled into the center of the madness, the darkness closing in. The laughter continued, swirling around her, until it felt like it was part of her, woven into her very being. She could hear the whispers, the voices of the others who had come before her, those who had been turned into puppets, whose souls were now trapped in this nightmarish play. The show had begun, and Mary had become one of them. Mary's body was stiff and rigid, her limbs no longer responding to her commands. The world around her seemed to fade in and out of focus, her vision clouded by a haze of terror and confusion. She could feel the cold, unyielding presence of the puppets surrounding her, their hands still gripping her arms, their cold, wooden fingers digging into her skin. Their hollow eyes stared into hers, unblinking, and the laughter that seemed to come from every corner of the theater, drowned out her thoughts. She tried to scream again, but no sound escaped her lips. It was as though the air itself had become thick, suffocating her, preventing her from making a single sound. The puppets jerked her onto the stage, their movements slow and deliberate, and the theater itself seemed to grow darker, the shadows pressing in from all sides. The flickering lights above her buzzed, casting erratic shadows that twisted and danced like malevolent spirits. "You belong here now," the figure said, its voice low and mocking, like a whispered promise of doom. It stepped forward, its long, spindly fingers extending to touch the edge of the stage. "Once you take your place, there is no leaving. There is only the show. Forever." The figure's words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and Mary's mind reeled. She fought against the puppets, but her body moved of its own accord. Her muscles were no longer under her control, her actions stiff and jerky, like she was one of them now, just another puppet in this twisted, nightmarish production. The other puppets gathered around her, their eyes filled with an empty, hollow gaze. Their bodies were grotesque, each one more twisted than the last, their faces frozen in expressions of agony and despair. They were no longer human, not truly. They had become nothing more than soulless vessels of wood and string. But their eyes, those hollow black eyes, still held a spark of something terrible. The figure raised its hand, and with a single motion, the stage erupted to life. The wooden puppets began to move, their jerky, mechanical motions now synchronized as they danced around her. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, their wooden bodies scraping against the stage with each movement. The laughter, that horrible mocking laughter, echoed again, louder this time, reverberating through the walls, filling every inch of the theater with its madness. Mary's breath hitched, and she could feel her body being forced to move in time with the puppets. Her arms lifted, her legs twisted, and though every fiber of her being screamed to resist, she couldn't. Her body obeyed, moving as if she were a puppet on a string, her joints creaking and snapping with each unnatural movement. The figure stepped closer, its shadow casting an eerie, distorted shape on the stage. It circled her, its cold eyes never leaving hers. The whispers returned, louder now, filling her mind with a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words incomprehensible but filled with dread. She could feel her sanity slipping away, her grip on reality slowly eroding as the figure continued to speak. "You were chosen," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "We all were, and now you will perform for them. You will dance, just like the others. You will entertain the audience. And when it's over," it paused, letting the silence hang in the air like a thick fog, "you will become one of us. Forever." The crowd of puppets began to close in around her, their twisted bodies moving in time with the eerie music that played from somewhere in the darkness. The figure's words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over again like a broken record. "You are one of us. You will perform. Forever." Her heart raced as the music swelled, its haunting melody washing over her. Her limbs moved faster now, her body spinning and twirling with the puppets, her once coherent thoughts now scattered like leaves in the wind. She tried to break free, tried to regain control, but the more she struggled, the more it seemed like the strings were tightening, pulling her deeper into the show. The theater was alive, pulsating with a dark energy that seemed to feed off her fear. The walls creaked and groaned, the floorboards groaning under the weight of the audience that was hidden in the shadows. She could feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting. But she couldn't see them. She couldn't see the faces of the audience, only the cold, blank eyes of the puppets surrounding her. And then, the laughter began again. It was louder now, almost deafening, and it seemed to come from all around her, surrounding her like a suffocating fog. It was the laughter of the lost, the laughter of those who had come before her, those who had become part of the show, their bodies twisted into the shapes of puppets, their souls trapped in the theater forever. She stumbled, her body shaking with the effort of trying to break free. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. But the more she fought, the tighter the strings became. She was trapped, bound to the stage, bound to the show. She could feel it now, the presence of the other puppets, their hollow, lifeless eyes staring at her, watching her every move. Their faces, twisted in eternal pain, seemed to mock her every attempt to escape. "You can't escape," the figure said, its voice soft, almost gentle. "There is no escape, Mary. Not for you. Not for any of us." The darkness seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing deeper, darker, until they swallowed everything whole. The puppets danced faster now, their movements becoming more erratic, more frenzied. The music played louder, its discordant notes twisting and warping in her mind. And then, with a final, shuddering breath, Mary's body gave in. She felt the strings tightening, pulling her into the rhythm of the dance. Her limbs moved without her command, her body jerking and twisting with the other puppets, trapped in a never-ending cycle of performance. She could feel her consciousness slipping away, her mind unraveling like the frayed threads of a broken puppet. The whispers filled her head, growing louder and louder until they drowned out everything else. She could hear the voices of the lost, the voices of those who had been here before her. Their cries for freedom, now just another part of the show. Her eyes, once filled with life and hope, grew hollow, empty. She could no longer remember who she had been. She was just another puppet, dancing on the stage for an audience she could never see, never escape. The laughter echoed in her ears, and she knew then that she was truly lost, lost in the theater, lost in the show. And the show would never end. Not for her, not for any of them. The theater was still, save for the faint rustling of wooden limbs scraping against the floor, the eerie melody continuing to swirl in the air, now warped and distorted. Mary could no longer discern where her body ended and the other puppets began. Her movements, once frantic and desperate, had become mechanical, each step and turn an echo of those who had come before her, those whose souls had been claimed by the theater. She tried to scream, but it was a silent cry. Her throat felt raw, as though it had forgotten the very act of vocalizing. Her eyes darted across the stage, but the shadows had grown darker, and the figures that danced with her had faded into almost nothingness, as though they were now part of the walls, part of the air itself. The laughter, the dark, resonant laughter, continued to reverberate in her skull, rattling her brain, filling her thoughts with dread. But it wasn't the laughter that haunted her now. It was the silence that followed it, the kind of silence that suffocated you, pressing on your chest until you could barely breathe, until you forgot what it was like to feel. The figure in the shadows, its face still obscured by the hood, its body long and twisted, stepped forward again, its skeletal hand reaching toward her. She could feel the weight of its gaze on her, a presence so cold and unsettling that it seemed to freeze the air around her. Slowly it spoke. "Welcome to your eternity, Mary," it said, its voice smooth and serpentine. "You are not the first, and you will not be the last, but you will be part of the show, forever." The words were like nails, sharp and relentless, driving into her mind. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but the strings, those invisible threads that bound her, held her in place, keeping her from moving, from speaking. The fear was still there, a gnawing pit in her stomach, but now it was something more, something worse. It was resignation. Her eyes wandered across the stage, seeing the faces of the other puppets once again. They were no longer strangers to her. She could recognize them now, not just from the way they moved or the way their eyes stared vacantly into nothingness, but from the way they had once been. They were the villagers, the ones who had vanished before her, their flesh now reduced to cold, brittle wood. She could see their faces twisted in the same horrified expression, frozen forever in time, their wide eyes staring at her with unspoken words. They had been like her once, full of life, full of hope, and now they were nothing. Nothing but puppets, lost to the theater just like her. The figure's laugh broke through her thoughts again, harsh and mocking. "You think you are different? You think you can escape?" it asked, its voice oozing with amusement. "You will learn, Mary, just like the others." Mary's legs felt weak beneath her, the strings pulling her in every direction, making her dance with a rhythm she had no control over. Her movements became smoother, the motions more fluid, but it didn't feel like her body anymore. It felt as though she was no longer in control, as though she was just another puppet, caught in a never-ending performance. The figure stepped closer still, its shadow engulfing her. Its face remained hidden beneath the hood, but Mary could feel its eyes, cold and malevolent, piercing through the darkness. "Do you see?" it whispered. "Do you see what you are now?" She didn't want to look, didn't want to acknowledge it, but her eyes were drawn to the stage. to the faces of the others who had been swallowed by the theater before her. Each puppet had a story. Each one had once been alive, once had dreams, had families, had hopes. And now they were all here, trapped, performing in an endless loop of torment and despair. Her mind began to break, her thoughts splintering like shattered glass. The weight of her fate settled over her like a cold, suffocating fog. She could feel the theater swallowing her whole, its walls tightening around her, its strings drawing her closer to the stage. She glanced at the audience. It was the first time she had truly seen them, the faceless masses sitting in the dark, their eyes gleaming in the shadows. They were the ones who watched, who waited for the show to continue. Their presence made her skin crawl, and the laughter, that mocking, hollow laughter, grew louder. But it wasn't just laughter anymore. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling her ears with their cruel words. "You're one of us now," they hissed. "You belong to the show." The figure behind her stepped forward once more, its long fingers grazing the back of her neck. The touch was cold, lifeless, like the hand of a corpse. "You will never leave," it said softly. "None of us ever do." The world around her seemed to blur, the audience's faces merging into a single, monstrous entity, their eyes empty and unblinking. The air felt thick, oppressive, like something was pushing down on her chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs. She could feel herself slipping away, the last vestiges of her humanity fading as the strings pulled tighter, the music playing faster, louder. The laughter rose again, this time almost deafening, and Mary's mind began to shatter under the weight of it. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe, couldn't remember what it was like to be alive. All that was left was the dance, the endless, monotonous dance. Her body moved with the others, the rhythm of their jerky, unnatural movements taking over her own. She could feel the weight of her limbs, the ache in her joints as they snapped and creaked, but it was no longer pain. It was just the way things were now. The theater had claimed her, and there was nothing left to do but dance. The figure stood at the edge of the stage, watching her with its cold, empty eyes. Its lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was the smile of a predator, watching its prey succumb to the inevitable. "You're just another puppet now, Mary," it said, its voice a mere whisper. "You are the show, and the show never ends." And in that moment, she understood. She wasn't just trapped in the theater. She had become the theater. She was a part of it, just like the others, frozen in time, a puppet for the audience to watch, to laugh at, to be entertained by. Forever. And the show would never end. Not for her. Not for any of them. The stage was her prison, and the strings that bound her were her only reality now. The laughter of the audience, the whispers in the dark, the cold touch of the figure, it was all part of the show. And she would dance, always, for them, until the end of time. The theater's hum seemed to grow louder, its vibrations rattling the very bones of the building. Mary's limbs moved in sync with the other puppets, their motions now fluid, their faces expressions of sheer emptiness, as though their souls had been drained entirely. The music played on, a haunting, discordant melody that only intensified the nightmare. The wooden boards beneath her creaked with each step, echoing through the vast emptiness of the theater. The audience, those faceless shadows that filled the seats, were a constant presence. Their eyes never wavered, never blinked. They simply stared, their gaze penetrating and unyielding, as if waiting for the next act to unfold, for the next puppet to join the performance. They were all around her now, their silent expectations more terrifying than any scream. Mary's body jerked once more, a sharp, mechanical motion, and her feet shuffled forward, her legs stiff as though the strings controlling her had a life of their own. She could feel them pulling tighter, winding her into the rhythm of the dance. The puppets around her, the others who had once been alive, continued their endless routine, their movements synchronized, their bodies locked in grotesque choreography. Their faces, frozen in twisted grins or expressions of horror, were no longer familiar. They were just like the others, and they would be forgotten, lost to the audience's cruel, hungry gaze. "Don't you want to know what happened to them?" A voice purred from the shadows. The figure, the master of the theater, moved closer, its presence cold and oppressive, like the weight of an ancient curse. Its silhouette was elongated, stretched by the dim light, but its eyes remained hidden beneath the dark hood. The voice, though smooth, held an underlying malice. "Don't you want to see what becomes of those who defy the show?" Mary's heart hammered in her chest, but her body moved with precision, forced to obey the strings. She couldn't look away, couldn't turn her head to see where the voice was coming from. Her every sense was distorted, her mind a prison as much as her body. The words, though taunting, still echoed in her head like a dull drumbeat. "Every puppet has a story," the figure continued, stepping forward. "And every story is a performance. But some of us, we were not meant to dance. We were not meant to stay." The world around her seemed to pulse with an ancient energy. The floor beneath her shifted, groaning in protest, as if the very foundation of the theater were alive, feeding off her terror. The figure's words lingered in the air, thick with a sense of foreboding. "You will see them, Mary," it whispered. "They are the lost ones, the forgotten." And then something shifted. The air grew cold, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt a shiver run through her, an emotion that was not forced by the strings. It was a raw, human feeling, fear, something she thought she had lost. The audience began to move. One by one, figures rose from the shadows, their bodies no longer hidden behind the darkness of the theater seats. Their movements were slow at first, dragging as though they were struggling to move after being frozen for so long. But then they began to walk forward toward the stage, toward Mary. Their faces, those twisted, grotesque faces, came into view. The audience was not just a crowd of faceless, hollow eyes. No, these were the remnants of the theater's previous victims. The ones who had wandered in, lured by the promise of a show, and never left. Mary's breath hitched in her throat. The first figure to step into the light was a man, his face contorted in agony. His eyes were wide, his mouth open in a silent scream, but there was nothing left of his humanity. His limbs were twisted, his body cracked and broken like the others. He was more wood than flesh now, his body stitched together with rough twine, like a puppet made from the pieces of someone who had once been whole. Behind him, another figure emerged. A woman, her hair falling in tangles around her face, her eyes blank but filled with the same unspoken terror. She was no more than a puppet now, her joints stiff, her movements jerky as she made her way toward the stage. And then another, and another, each one more disturbing than the last. Mary could see them now, the true nature of the audience. These were the people who had watched the show, who had once been like her, but they had been consumed by the theater. Their bodies had been twisted and warped, reduced to nothing more than broken vessels, their souls trapped in the theater's clutches forever. The figure, watching Mary's realization with a sickening smile, stepped closer. "Do you see now?" it asked softly, almost kindly. "This is the fate of all who watch the show, who believe they can escape. You think the performance is just for you? No, you're a part of it, Mary. You always were." The words hit her like a wave. Her mind, already fragile from the torment of the strings, began to shatter under the weight of the truth. She was not the first to fall victim to this cursed theater, and she would not be the last. She had become part of the performance, just another puppet in the endless cycle of despair. The audience, no, the puppets, continued to move closer, their expressions frozen in the moments of their greatest fear and pain. The theater was no longer just a building. It was a prison, a living entity, feeding off the souls of those who were foolish enough to believe it was a place of entertainment. Each figure, each broken puppet, was a testament to the horror of the show, and the show was never meant to end. "You belong to us now, Mary," the figure in the shadows said, its voice a low, menacing whisper. "And so do they, all of them." Mary's body trembled. She had hoped, no, she had prayed, that there was some escape. That this nightmare, this terrible trap, was not her fate. But the truth was undeniable. There was no escape. There never had been. Her body was no longer hers to command. The strings had taken control, and now there would be no more resistance. She would dance. She would perform for the audience, just as the others had done before her. And when it was over, she would be another puppet, another forgotten soul, lost to the theater forever. The show would continue, unbroken, an eternal performance in which every puppet played their part, no matter how broken, no matter how lost. And Mary would never leave. Not ever. The lights flickered once more, and the laughter of the audience filled the air, a harsh, cruel reminder of what had been and what would always be. The show had begun again. Forever. The stage seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching like tendrils across the floor, pulling the last traces of light into the abyss. Mary's limbs moved as if they were not her own, each step a reminder that she was no longer a person, but a part of the performance, an instrument of the theater's twisted will. Her gaze flickered to the audience, or what was left of it. The puppets had gathered in a circle, their eyes empty and unblinking, their bodies like grotesque marionettes. They swayed in time with the music, their jerky, erratic movements more mechanical than human. Each puppet was once a villager, a person who had ventured into the theater, full of life and hope, only to be claimed by the shadows. Now they were nothing but hollow vessels, their souls long consumed, their bodies turned into macabre instruments of the theater's dark purpose. The whispers that had plagued her mind since her arrival grew louder, swirling around her like a storm of forgotten voices. The words were not coherent, but they were filled with despair, fragments of cries, of pleas, of lost souls reaching out from the dark corners of the theater. "Mary!" A voice called from the shadows. It was a whisper, but it carried with it an unmistakable familiarity. "Mary, you don't have to do this." She turned, her head jerking to the side with an unnatural sharpness, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. The voice sounded like her mother's, soft, comforting, filled with love. But it was wrong, twisted by the dark presence that permeated the theater. "Don't listen to them, Mary," the voice continued, growing louder now, almost pleading. "You were not meant to be here. You can still escape. You can still." But before the voice could finish, a cold, eerie laugh filled the air, cutting through the words like a knife. The figure from the shadows, its tall, dark form, stepped forward again, its face still hidden beneath the hood. It was the master of the theater, the one who had lured Mary into this nightmare. Its bony fingers reached up, pulling back the hood, revealing a face so grotesque, so twisted, that it was beyond recognition. It was a face of decay, a mask of bone and sinew, its features sharp and hollow, its eyes voids of darkness. The skin was stretched thin over its skull, as if the figure had once been human, but had long since lost its humanity. The very sight of it made Mary's heart race, her body frozen in fear. "Foolish child," the figure sneered, its voice dripping with malice. "You cannot escape the show. You will never leave." Mary's breath hitched as she took a step back, her body reacting out of sheer instinct. But the strings pulled her forward, forcing her to move in sync with the others. The laughter of the audience, those twisted, empty shells, echoed louder now, reverberating through the walls of the theater. "Do you see, Mary?" the figure continued, its voice low and mocking. "This is your fate now. You are no different from the others. You are just another puppet, another piece in the grand performance." Mary's mind swirled with confusion, with terror. She tried to scream, tried to break free, but her body refused to obey. Her limbs jerked and twitched, her joints stiff and unyielding, as the strings tightened their hold on her. She was trapped. There was no escape. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. It reached out a skeletal hand, placing it on her shoulder with a cold, unnatural gentleness. The touch sent a shock of dread through her spine. "You were always meant to be part of the show, Mary," it whispered. "You just didn't know it yet." And with those words, something inside her broke. It wasn't a physical pain, but something deeper, something more profound. It was the realization that there was no escape, that she was just another lost soul, doomed to dance in this dark theater for eternity. She was a puppet, a mere instrument in the hands of something far older, far more powerful than she could ever understand. Her body moved involuntarily, her limbs jerking to the rhythm of the twisted melody. She could feel her heart racing, her breath shallow and quick, but it didn't matter. She couldn't stop. She couldn't even think. The theater had claimed her, body and soul. And then the audience stood, their movements synchronized with hers. They were no longer just watching, they were a part of it now. They were the show. They had always been the show. Mary's eyes flitted from face to face, recognizing the villagers she had once known. But their faces were different now. Their eyes were empty, hollowed out by years of being trapped in the theater's grip. They were like her, puppets, mere shadows of who they once were. There was no humanity left in them. They were lost to the show, bound by the same strings that controlled her. The laughter grew louder, rising to a crescendo, the sound deafening in its intensity. The figures around her began to move more frantically, their jerky motions becoming faster, more violent, as though they were caught in a frenzy. Their faces twisted with an expression that was part terror, part despair. But Mary couldn't look away. She couldn't escape the performance. "You see now, don't you?" the figure in the shadows said. Its voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was no kindness in it. "There is no end. There is no escape. Only the show. Forever." Mary's mind shattered under the weight of the truth. She was not just part of the theater's dark world. She was the theater. Every movement, every breath, every twitch of her limbs was dictated by the strings that bound her. She was the show, and the show would never end. The stage seemed to stretch on endlessly before her, the audience's eyes following her every movement, their vacant stares fixed upon her with hunger. The music swelled once more, a haunting symphony that filled the air with a sense of impending doom. The theater was alive, feeding off her terror, drawing her deeper into its grip. And there was no way out. Mary's movements became more fluid, more practiced, as though the strings had now become an extension of her own body. The once frenzied jerks had transformed into a slow, deliberate dance. Her every movement was precise, controlled, as if she had always been a puppet, as if this was her purpose. The audience watched in silence, their eyes following her every move. They were waiting for something. They were waiting for her to complete her performance. And Mary realized, with horror, that she was the final act. She was the star of the show. The figure in the shadows smiled, its skeletal grin widening. "Enjoy the show, Mary," it whispered, its voice barely audible over the music. "It's all for you." And then, as if on cue, the entire theater erupted into motion. The lights flickered wildly, the music reached a deafening crescendo, and the audience began to cheer, their hollow voices merging into a single, monstrous roar. The show had begun again, and this time it would never end. The sound of the audience's cheers was deafening, filling the theater with an oppressive force that seemed to shake the very walls. The laughter, too, was there, a distorted, guttural sound that vibrated through Mary's bones, like 1,000 voices echoing through the corridors of her mind. She could no longer tell where the applause ended and the terror began. Her movements were no longer just mechanical, they were methodical, precise. She danced, the strings pulling her in all directions, guiding her like a marionette in a twisted ballet. She didn't want to move, didn't want to perform, but the strings didn't care. They controlled her body now, bending her to their will, forcing her into the motions she could no longer resist. The music swirled around her, the melody changing, shifting with each step. The audience, those hollow, lifeless beings, watched with eyes that never blinked, their expressions locked in a state of unfeeling anticipation. They were not just spectators, they were participants, each one a part of the show, a cog in the endless machine that the theater had become. The figure in the shadows, the one who had lured her here, the one who had twisted her fate, watched from the edge of the stage, its bony fingers twitching, as if it could feel the performance unfolding with glee. It didn't move. It didn't need to. It had already claimed her, had already bound her to the theater's will. Now it was content to watch her dance, to watch her become another broken piece of the show. Mary's heart hammered in her chest, but the beat was out of sync with the rhythm of the dance. She could still feel the warmth of her own blood rushing through her veins, the remnants of the human life she once had. But it was slipping away slowly, piece by piece, until all that remained was a puppet. Her thoughts were fractured, scattered, a jumble of confusion and dread. But one thought rose to the surface, clear and terrifying. There was no escape. She had tried desperately to break free. She had fought, kicking and screaming, but it was all in vain. The strings were too strong, the grip of the theater too powerful. She was trapped, no, worse than trapped. She was bound body and soul to this cursed place. The show would go on forever, and she would play her part until the end of time. The music grew louder, more frenetic, the tempo accelerating with each passing second. The audience began to chant, their voices rising in unison, a wave of sound that seemed to push Mary forward, pushing her deeper into the performance. She could hear the words now, though they were distorted, garbled, as if coming from a far-off distance. Dance, dance, forever, dance for us. Her limbs moved of their own accord, her feet no longer stumbling, no longer struggling. She was performing the dance, the one that all the others had danced before her, the one that had been passed down through countless generations. It was a ritual, a twisted cycle that would never end. Mary's vision blurred, the edges of the stage fading into darkness as she spun. The world around her seemed to bend and twist, stretching, distorting, as if the theater itself were warping reality. She could feel it, the weight of the place pressing down on her, squeezing the life from her. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick, suffocating. The audience's faces melted into one grotesque, faceless entity, a swirling mass of shadows and empty eyes. Her movements became faster, more erratic, until it felt as if her limbs were no longer her own. The strings were pulling her in every direction, forcing her to move faster, to perform harder. She was caught in a frenzy now, spinning uncontrollably, her body jerking to the rhythm of the music. The laughter, the twisted, hollow laughter, grew louder, drowning out everything else. It filled her ears, reverberating through her skull, until she couldn't tell if it was coming from the audience, the figure in the shadows, or from somewhere deep within her own mind. Her chest constricted, her breathing shallow and erratic. She could feel the suffocating pressure of the theater's hold, the weight of the curse pressing down on her. Her hands twitched, clawing at the strings that bound her. But they were too tight, too strong. The more she fought, the tighter they became. And then a single, clear thought broke through the madness. I am lost. The realization struck her like a blow. She was lost, lost to the theater, lost to the show. There was no returning from this place, no salvation. She would never leave. She would never be free. She was nothing but a puppet, a piece of the performance, caught in an eternal dance. Her limbs moved in perfect synchronization with the others, her body bending and twisting in unnatural ways. She was not alone anymore. The other puppets, those lost souls who had once been villagers, were with her, their movements blending with hers. They danced together in a grotesque circle, their faces locked in expressions of torment and despair. And yet, even in the midst of the madness, Mary couldn't help but feel something she hadn't felt in a long time, an overwhelming, crushing sense of emptiness. The puppets were not just part of the show, they were the show. They had been consumed by the theater, just as she was being consumed now. The figure in the shadows moved closer, its dark form looming over the stage. "You see, Mary?" it said, its voice low and cruel. "This is your legacy now. You will dance forever, just as they have. You will be a part of the show, a part of the performance. And when you are no longer able to dance, when your strings finally snap, another will take your place. Mary's mind spun, her thoughts a blur, but she knew one thing: there was no way out. She had become part of the theater, part of the twisted cycle that had claimed so many before her. And now, she was bound to it forever. The lights dimmed, casting the stage into darkness, but the music continued. The audience's cheers echoed through the theater, their voices growing louder, rising into a deafening roar. Mary danced on, her body moving in time with the music, the strings pulling her forward. The show had no end. The performance would continue, forever, and she would never stop dancing. The air in the theater was thick, charged with an unnatural energy that hummed in the walls, in the floor beneath Mary's feet, in the very space around her. The shadows pressed in closer, filling the edges of her vision, stretching toward her like hungry hands, eager to claim what little remained of her humanity. She could feel the weight of the audience's gaze, not just on her, but on the entire stage. Their hollow eyes followed her every movement, unblinking, unfeeling. Each movement she made, every step, every turn, felt like it was ripping a part of her soul away. The strings that bound her were no longer just physical. They had become spiritual, emotional, twisting deep into the core of her being, reshaping her, hollowing her out. She wasn't just a puppet in this theater anymore. She was the theater. Every movement, every breath, every flicker of her fading consciousness was part of the endless performance that had claimed her body and soul. The music surged, becoming a chaotic symphony of discordant notes, a cacophony of sound that twisted her insides, making her stomach churn. It felt as though the music itself was alive, feeding off the darkness that had swallowed the theater whole. The tempo quickened, and her body responded, moving faster, jerking harder, as if she were being driven by the music itself, as though her limbs no longer belonged to her. Her eyes flicked back toward the audience, those lifeless, faceless figures who had once been villagers like her, once people with hopes and dreams. But now they were nothing but shadows, empty shells. She saw their faces again, the familiar ones, twisted into grotesque forms, their eyes wide, frozen in a permanent state of horror. They too were trapped. Their expressions, once so full of life, were now nothing but masks of despair, their movements stiff and mechanical, like marionettes controlled by the same unseen hand that controlled Mary. Is this what we become? She thought, though the question felt more like a whisper in the back of her mind than something she could ask aloud. The sound of the music filled her ears once more, drowning out everything else. She had stopped thinking of escape a long time ago. There was no escape. There was only the dance, only the performance. Suddenly, in the stillness between notes, a voice broke through the noise. Mary! Her heart skipped a beat. It was familiar, too familiar. A voice from her past, soft and full of concern, calling her name. It was the voice of her mother, the one who had always kept her safe, the one who had whispered to her in the darkness when she was small, telling her stories to ease her fears. But that voice wasn't real. Not anymore. Mary, you don't belong here. Her breath caught in her throat. The whispers were becoming louder, insistent now. The voice of her mother, the faces of the villagers, they all melded together into a single, incomprehensible blur of memories and distorted fears. You're lost, Mary. You are the theater now. There is no going back. You will dance forever. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face as she fought to break free of the strings, the pull of the music, the pull of the audience's collective gaze. But the harder she fought, the tighter the strings pulled. Her body jerked uncontrollably, the dance becoming more violent, the movements growing sharper, more erratic. She could feel herself losing control, her mind spinning in a dizzying spiral as her body obeyed the rhythm of the music, her limbs moving faster, the strings tugging her in every direction. Stop, she begged, though her voice barely rose above the music. Please stop. But the music didn't stop. It never stopped. It grew louder, more frantic, until it consumed everything, until the only thing left in the world was the endless, oppressive rhythm that forced her to move, to dance, to perform. "Please," she whispered again, her voice breaking, though she knew it was pointless. "I don't want this. I don't want to be a puppet." The figure in the shadows, the master, stepped forward again, its form looming over the stage, its face hidden in the darkness. The air grew colder, the very space around her growing thicker with malevolent energy. The shadows seemed to crawl closer, coiling around Mary like a net, tightening, suffocating. The figure's voice came again, low and cruel, echoing through the theater. "You were always meant to be a part of the show, Mary. You were chosen. You just didn't know it yet. Every puppet that has come before you has danced their final dance. And now, it is your turn." Mary's heart pounded in her chest, her breathing shallow, rapid. She felt the cold hand of despair wrap around her, squeezing the last remnants of hope from her soul. There was no escape. There was no way out. The master's laugh filled the air, high-pitched and mocking. "There is no release, no end. The show will go on, forever." The audience began to rise in unison, their jerky, lifeless movements synchronizing with the music. They were all part of it now, their bodies, their souls, consumed by the theater. And they too were trapped, bound to the same fate that had claimed Mary. There was no getting out. There was no escape. Her mind screamed in protest, but her body obeyed. She could feel the strings tightening, pulling her in all directions, forcing her into a frenzied, violent dance. Her arms flung out, her legs spun, her body jerking uncontrollably to the rhythm of the music. Her thoughts were a blur, a haze of panic and terror. "I don't want to be here," she screamed inside her mind, but the words never left her lips. She was trapped, her voice silenced by the overwhelming weight of the performance. She was nothing now, just another puppet. The music became deafening, the air thick with the sound of 1,000 voices, 1,000 screams, echoing through the theater. The master's shadow loomed over her, its skeletal hands reaching out as though to pull her deeper into the performance, deeper into the darkness. She could feel herself slipping away, could feel the last remnants of her own will dissolving, fading into nothingness. She was lost, and there was no saving her now. Her body moved on its own, her limbs jerking and spinning, faster and faster, the music swallowing her whole. There was no escape. There was no end. Only the show. Forever. The world around her had dissolved into pure chaos, a whirlwind of sound and motion that drowned out any trace of her former self. The music pulsed in her ears like a beating heart, pounding, relentless, unforgiving. Her movements, no longer her own, had become one with the rhythm. She was no longer Mary, the girl who had once laughed, cried, and dreamed, but something else. Something lost. The stage beneath her feet had transformed into a vast, shifting abyss. The wooden boards were no longer stable. They warped and twisted as she danced, buckling and creaking under her weight. The audience, too, had changed. They had become a mass of shadows, their once human forms merging into a dark sea of faceless figures. Their eyes were still locked on her, unblinking, but there was no humanity left in them. Only hunger, a deep, unending hunger for her, no, for all of them, for the souls that fed this twisted performance. Her legs carried her across the stage with a mind of their own. She stumbled once, nearly tripping, but the strings that held her jerked her upright. Her arms shot out, a puppet's limbs stretched to unnatural lengths, spinning through the air in impossible arcs. The audience's breathless silence was suffocating, and yet, in the oppressive stillness, she could hear something else, a sound that chilled her to the bone. It was a low, scraping noise like the sound of something, or someone, being dragged across the floor. At first, she thought it was just another trick of her mind, the desperation of her situation bending reality. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. She felt it in her bones, a vibration that ran through the stage and into her very soul. The scraping grew more frantic, then stopped abruptly. In that split second of silence, her heart skipped a beat. And then a whisper, a voice, barely audible above the music, but unmistakable. "Mary!" Her breath caught in her throat. She froze mid-spin, her limbs trembling as the voice echoed through the theater, familiar, but twisted, warped by the darkness that now consumed it. It was her mother's voice again. But this time, it was cold, empty. It carried with it a faint sound, a whisper, barely recognizable as anything human. "Please stop." The words cut through her like a blade. For a moment, she thought she might break free, might shatter the strings that bound her, might tear herself away from this nightmare. But her limbs refused to listen. Her body jerked forward, forced into another step, another spin. "You will not escape," the voice hissed again, as if to answer her thoughts, as if to remind her of her place in this never-ending nightmare. The scraping sound returned, closer now, and then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure, crawling on all fours, dragging its twisted body across the stage. The form was hunched and grotesque, like a puppet whose strings had long since been severed, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. The face, her face, was a horrific parody of life. The features were stretched and distorted, eyes wide, unblinking, staring at her with an intensity that sent a chill through her core. But it wasn't her. It couldn't be. It was someone else. The figure, no, the puppet, dragged itself closer to her, the sound of its scraping body reverberating through the theater like the scratching of fingernails on a chalkboard. Its mouth moved, its lips parting, but no words came out, only a hollow, gurgling sound like air escaping from a punctured lung. The audience shifted as one, their heads tilting, their eyes following the movement, their expressions unchanged, unfeeling. The figure was almost upon her now. She could see the twisted remnants of what had once been a human face, features that had long since decayed, the skin stretched tight over bone. But the eyes, those hollow eyes, still gleamed with a terrible, knowing recognition. The puppet that crawled toward her was no longer human. It was a reflection of everything the theater had consumed, a reminder of all those who had come before her, all those who had danced and been broken, only to be absorbed by the cruel, insatiable darkness that the theater represented. The music stopped. Suddenly, the silence was unbearable. The stillness hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. Mary stood frozen, her chest heaving, as the figure reached her. It crawled up to her, its movements jerky, almost mechanical, before it stopped just inches away. Its cold, dead eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, she could feel something old, something ancient, stirring within the theater. Something malevolent, powerful, and eternal. This was not just a performance. This was a prison for souls, a prison for her. The puppet's mouth opened wide, and a low, guttural sound emerged from its throat. Not a voice, not words, but something primal, something deep and hollow. The sound reverberated through her chest, filling her with a paralyzing fear that she couldn't escape. "There is no end to the dance," the puppet rasped, its voice like the creak of old wood. "Only the performance. Forever." Her heart raced, panic surging through her veins. She struggled against the strings, her body fighting to break free, but it was useless. The strings were unbreakable now. She was part of the show. She had become the show. The puppet's limbs twitched and jerked violently, as if to emphasize the point. Its gaze never wavered, its sightless eyes locked onto hers, as if it were trying to tell her something, trying to make her understand that there was no escape, no way out. Her limbs moved once more, against her will, forced by the strings that had taken root deep inside her, threading through her very soul. She danced again, but this time it wasn't just her body moving. It was her entire existence being manipulated, contorted, molded into something unrecognizable. And she realized, with a sickening clarity, that she had become just another puppet, another piece in the show, and the show would never end. The scraping sound of the puppet's twisted body dragged on the stage behind her, a constant reminder that she was not alone in this place, that she would never be alone again. There was only the dance, forever, and she would never be free. The theater was alive with a quiet, oppressive tension, the air thick with the scent of decay and despair. The music, once frantic and chaotic, now hung in the air like a dying whisper, soft and eerie, just loud enough to drown out any other sound. The entire space felt suspended in time, caught in a moment of cruel anticipation, waiting for the next movement, the next performance. But Mary knew that the dance had no end. It would continue, dragging her along, pulling her deeper into its endless cycle. She could feel the eyes of the audience, even without looking. They were all staring at her, unblinking, unfathomable. The villagers, no, the former villagers, had become part of the theater now, like the puppets that surrounded her. They too were trapped, bound to this place, bound to the dark force that controlled them. Their faces were blank, empty shells, but their eyes were the only thing left of who they once were. Hollow and haunted, they watched her, as if they too knew the truth that she had just discovered. There was no escape. The string that tethered her to the stage was not just physical, not just a binding of flesh and bone. It had sunk deep into her soul, carving through her, twisting her spirit until there was nothing left but this. The performance, the dance. Her body moved again, as if it had a mind of its own. She didn't want to dance. She didn't want to perform, but the strings wouldn't allow her to stop. Each step, each spin, each frantic jerk of her limbs, it was all forced. The music surged again, louder, sharper, more insistent, pushing her faster. Her muscles burned, her chest ached, her body screamed in protest, but it didn't matter. The show went on. In the corner of her vision, she saw the puppet again, the one with her face. Its body still jerked and twisted, moving in the same unnatural way, dragging itself across the stage with a sickening scrape. Its eyes remained locked on hers, never wavering, always watching, always waiting. It was as if it were waiting for her to join it, waiting for her to embrace the truth of this place. Once you are part of the performance, you never leave. But Mary refused. She couldn't accept it. Her limbs twisted against the strings, fighting, straining, but it was no use. The more she fought, the tighter the strings pulled, the more the music surged. She gasped for breath, her eyes wild with panic. She could feel her mind slipping, her grip on her own reality slipping away with each beat of the cursed rhythm. The audience's gaze was unbearable, pressing down on her like a physical weight. And then, as if the very walls of the theater had eyes, the voice returned. This time, it was not her mother's. It was something darker, deeper, and it echoed through her bones, reverberating in her skull like a terrible truth she could no longer escape. "Mary, you were always meant to be here." The voice was a hiss, slithering in her mind. "We chose you long ago. You are ours now. Forever." The words felt like a wound, deep and unhealable. She was no longer just a puppet. She was the puppet, the one who would never leave, never be free. She had become the show. She had become the very essence of the theater. Her heart beat faster, a frantic rhythm that mirrored the music now. Each thump felt like a countdown, a ticking clock, racing towards something she didn't understand but knew would be her undoing. Her body continued to jerk and spin, the strings guiding her every movement, forcing her to dance in a way she couldn't control. The puppet that crawled on the stage, the one that looked like her, joined in the performance now. It twisted and contorted in time with her movements, an eerie mirror, a reflection of the tragedy that had become her existence. She screamed, but the sound was lost in the music, swallowed whole by the endless notes that continued to play. She screamed again, louder this time, but no one heard. No one could hear. The audience was silent, their faces blank, their eyes lifeless. They were as much a part of the show as she was. "You are the show," the voice echoed again, this time louder, clearer. "There is no escape, Mary. There never was." Her limbs moved faster now, quicker, each movement more desperate than the last. She could feel the cold weight of the strings pulling her deeper into the performance, her body thrashing uncontrollably. Her puppet, was now standing, its twisted limbs moving in time with hers. The thing was her reflection, her shadow, a hollow version of herself, but it was moving as she moved, dancing as she danced. No, she thought, her mind screaming. I am not it. I am not one of them. I will not be like them. But it was too late. Her body moved of its own accord, the strings guiding her every step, every motion, every twitch. The music swelled around her, filling her ears, drowning out everything. She felt herself slipping away, her identity dissolving, her humanity vanishing with every second that passed. She was no longer Mary. She was the show, the performance that would never end. She wanted to fight. She wanted to scream. But the music, the endless, haunting music, made her lose all sense of self. Her thoughts became fragmented, like pieces of glass, sharp and disconnected. The shadowy figures in the audience watched her with unwavering eyes, and she knew deep down that they had all been there once. They had been just like her, trapped in the dance, the endless cycle of performance. Her body twisted in a violent spin, and for a moment, just a fleeting moment, she thought she could hear something beyond the music. A whisper, a voice, faint but real. Help me. She froze. It was soft, weak, but unmistakable. Something was still reaching out. Someone was still human, even in this twisted place. She strained against the strings again, forcing her limbs to halt. Her body stopped mid-dance, caught between two movements, suspended in the air. Who? She whispered, her voice trembling. Help me. She strained her ears, her heart racing. The voice was coming from somewhere in the audience. But who? Was it another lost soul? Someone else trapped here? The music swelled again, forcing her body to move. But she wasn't entirely lost. Not yet. The voice. It was calling to her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. And this time, for the first time since the theater had claimed her, she felt something stir within her. A flicker of hope. Maybe there was a way out after all. Maybe there was a chance to break free. But as the music reached a crescendo, and her body twisted into another grotesque movement, she realized the horrible truth. The theater had claimed her, and now it was taking everything, her body, her soul, her very being. She was no longer Mary. She was one of them. The voice calling to her was just another part of the show, another lie. And the dance, it would never stop. The darkness in the theater seemed to close in around her, thick and suffocating, as if the very walls were alive, breathing in unison with the pulsating rhythm of the music. Her limbs were no longer her own. Each jerk, each violent spin, was like an animal caught in a trap, struggling but never free. The strings tugged at her, pulling tighter, deeper, until she could feel them winding into her very soul. Every movement felt like a violation, a betrayal of her own will. The whispering voice had stopped, replaced by the ever-present, ever-pressing music, but its echo lingered in the back of her mind. Help me. It was all she could hear now. A hollow cry that seemed to reverberate from every corner of the theater, from every shadow in the audience. The figures sitting there, those lifeless, hollow shapes with their empty eyes, watched her without emotion, their faces frozen in a permanent expression of horror. They were no longer human. They were just audience members, forever trapped, forever waiting for the next show. Her gaze shifted involuntarily. The puppet that had once crawled toward her, her own twisted reflection, was now standing, its crooked limbs moving in time with her own. Its face had become more familiar now, more like hers with each passing moment. Its features were contorting and shifting, taking on the same hollow, lifeless look as the audience. It was becoming her, Mary the puppet, the performer, the trapped one. And she realized, with a horrifying clarity, that she was becoming it as well. The strings pulled harder. She tried to scream again, but no sound came. Her throat felt tight, constricted, as if it were being choked by the invisible threads. She couldn't breathe. The music continued to play, each note more suffocating than the last. The puppet, her reflection, reached out toward her, its twisted hand moving unnaturally, its fingers stretching too far, too long, as if it had been waiting for her to make the final step. And then it spoke. "Welcome to the show, Mary." Its voice was cold, empty, but it echoed through her like a bell tolling, marking the end of something. What was it? Her freedom? Her identity? Her life? "You can never leave," it continued, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "You will dance forever, just like us. Just like me." Her heart slammed in her chest, the pulse of fear coursing through her. She fought harder against the strings, but her movements were no longer hers to control. The puppet had taken over, its limbs, its face, its soul. It was now part of her, and she was part of it. She wanted to collapse. She wanted to scream, to claw at the walls of this twisted place, to tear away the strings that had bound her. But the music, the relentless, hypnotic music, pulled her forward. Her limbs jerked, each movement more frantic, more desperate. She tried to stop, but her body obeyed the strings, swaying and twisting in unnatural ways. The puppet in front of her mirrored every motion, every twitch, its face stretching in a grotesque parody of her own. "You're part of the show now, Mary," it repeated, its voice growing more distorted, as if its words were being warped by the very darkness of the theater. "There's no going back. We all dance. We all become the show." She could feel it. She could feel the theater consuming her, piece by piece. Her limbs were no longer her own, her body no longer hers to command. The strings that controlled her were a part of her now, tangled in her very essence, pulling her deeper into the void. The faces in the audience watched her, their eyes gleaming with the same hollow emptiness. They were no longer people. They were just bodies, shells of those who had come before her, the lost souls. Her movements grew slower, more deliberate, and the puppet that was once an extension of her own terror now felt more like an extension of herself. They were the same, two halves of a whole. The realization hit her like a wave. She wasn't just trapped in this place. She was becoming it. She was becoming one of them. Her body moved of its own accord, and she felt her identity slip further away. Her reflection smiled at her, but it wasn't her smile. It was the smile of the puppet, the smile of a thing that had no soul left to lose. "We all become part of the show," the puppet whispered, its voice now a mocking parody of the sweet, familiar sound of her own voice. "You'll dance just like us, forever." And then it laughed, a hollow, rasping laugh that shook the very walls of the theater. The sound echoed in her ears, filling her mind with a sickening sensation. She felt herself losing control, felt her body moving faster now, spinning, twisting, contorting into unnatural shapes. The audience, the shadows, the endless faces, they were all waiting for her to become one of them. The lights in the theater flickered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something. A flash of light, a glimpse of the world outside, the village, the streets, the life she had once known. Was it real? Or was it just another illusion, another trap designed to keep her in the dance? "You'll never see the world again," the voice whispered, the puppet's voice blending with her own. "This is your world now. The show." The music swelled, louder now, more frantic. Her limbs jerked violently, the strings pulling at her like a puppet being controlled by a cruel hand. The stage beneath her feet seemed to stretch and warp, growing more distorted, more nightmarish with each passing second. The faces of the audience blurred, shifting in and out of focus, as if they were no longer real, as if they were nothing more than figments of a twisted imagination. And then, as if in answer to her last, desperate thought, she felt a sharp tug at her chest. The strings pulled harder than ever before, dragging her deeper into the darkness of the stage, pulling her into the abyss where there was no escape. The puppet's face loomed closer, its eyes wide, its twisted grin stretching impossibly far. "We are all trapped here, Mary," it said, its voice no longer her own, but something else, something darker. You are not alone. The strings pulled tighter, and the last shred of her humanity vanished. She was no longer Mary. She was no longer herself. She had become the puppet, the performer, the endless dance. And in that moment, as her body spun once more, she understood the terrible truth. There was no end. There was no escape. The show would continue forever. And she was the star. The theater plunged into a deeper, more suffocating silence. The music had ceased, but the emptiness it left behind was worse than any sound. Mary, if she could still be called that, hung suspended in the center of the stage, her body twisted and bent in ways that no human body should ever move. The strings tugged at her from every direction, pulling her limbs and joints, forcing her to remain in that grotesque position, suspended between what had been and what was. She wanted to scream, to break free from the chains that held her, but her voice was lost, trapped somewhere within the puppet strings that now governed her every thought, every movement. Around her, the darkness seemed to pulse with life, alive with something ancient and unforgiving. The walls, once solid and real, had dissolved into nothingness, as if the theater itself were fading into the void. The audience, those hollow, lifeless shells, watched with their dead, unblinking eyes, their faces frozen in expressions of terror that seemed to mirror her own. Were they truly watching, or were they merely echoes of what had been, trapped here like her? She couldn't tell anymore. The puppets, no, the audience, all remained in place, motionless like grotesque statues, their eyes fixed on her, staring through her, as if she had become a part of them, part of the show, part of the cursed cycle. She no longer knew who she was, or where she had come from. The girl who had entered this theater was gone, swallowed up by the performance. The puppet version of herself, a twisted, lifeless replica, moved in synchrony with her. Its eyes gleamed with the same hollow emptiness as the others. It was her, but not her. A twisted version, a reflection of what she had become. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape them. There was no freedom here, no hope, no way out. The strings that held her were now tangled in her mind, in her soul, like a prison that would never let her go. "You'll never escape," the voice spoke again, the voice that had once been her mother's, but now was something darker, deeper, colder. "We're all part of the same show now." The words echoed around her like a curse. Each syllable seemed to carve itself into her skin, into her mind. She had become part of this endless, cruel cycle. There was no escaping the show, no way to undo what had been done. She was no longer just a victim. She was now one of the performers, a puppet herself. The stage seemed to stretch and twist, the floor beneath her feet now an endless abyss. She tried to move, tried to fight the strings, but her body refused to obey. It was as if her flesh had become part of the theater itself, part of the sickening performance. The puppet of herself, the one who had once crawled and jerked across the stage, now stood beside her, its expression fixed in that same twisted grin. She could feel the puppet inside her, in every fiber of her being. It was her. She was it. And then the theater shifted again, the walls contracting, the ceiling looming lower, as if it were closing in around her. The audience, the lost souls, began to shift, their bodies contorting, their faces twisting in grotesque masks of pain and fear. They moved together, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were all bound by the same strings, caught in the same trap. They were puppets too, just like her. All of them, forever trapped in the performance, forever caught in the never-ending show. She tried to move again, her body screaming, but it was no use. The strings pulled harder, dragging her back into the center of the stage. The puppet of herself mirrored her movements, and the two of them, her and the puppet, began to perform again, spinning, twisting, the music swelling once more, filling the theater with its oppressive rhythm. "There's no escape, Mary," the voice hissed, louder now, the words sharp and insistent. "You are the show now. You will dance forever." Her body moved involuntarily, each step, each turn forced by the strings. The puppet mirrored her perfectly, its movements becoming more fluid, more graceful, more lifelike. It was as if they were one now, no longer two separate beings, but one unified force. The strings that had once controlled her now were her, and she could feel them deep inside, twisting through her veins, pulling her deeper into the performance. "You are ours now," the voice continued, its tone growing more venomous. "You will never leave. This is your fate. This is your forever." The music soared again, rising to a deafening crescendo, and her body, her puppet body, moved faster, more violently, more desperately. She could feel herself losing control, her mind slipping further away, her sense of self dissolving into the performance, into the darkness that enveloped her. She was no longer Mary. She was just another puppet, another part of the endless show. Her movements grew more frantic, more erratic, as if trying to fight against the invisible force that controlled her. But it was no use. The more she struggled, the tighter the strings pulled. She could feel her mind breaking, the pressure building, the music driving her toward madness. The puppet that was her reflection, her twisted, lifeless twin, spun and danced beside her, its face frozen in that same mocking grin. "We are all part of the show," it whispered, its voice like 1,000 mocking echoes. "You can't fight it. You never could." The theater itself seemed to warp and change around her, the walls stretching and contracting like a living thing. The audience, the lost souls, watched her without emotion, their empty eyes fixed on her, waiting for the next act, the next movement. They were trapped here too, just like her. They were part of the show, part of the endless cycle. And as the music swelled again, louder, more oppressive, she realized the terrible truth. She wasn't just trapped here. She had become part of it. The performance would never end. There would be no final curtain, no escape, no freedom. She would dance forever, just like the others, just like the puppets. And the show would go on, endlessly, forever. The music began to slow, its haunting notes now a distorted lullaby that pulsed in time with the rhythm of her body's relentless movements. Mary, or what remained of her, was no longer able to feel the world outside this nightmare. The theater, the audience, the endless, twisting dance, it had consumed her completely. She was now just another part of the show, her thoughts slipping away like sand through her fingers. As she twisted and spun in unnatural contortions, the audience stared at her, those lost souls with their empty, unblinking eyes. They were silent now, but their gaze was heavy, oppressive, as if they were watching something more than just a performance. They were waiting. They had always been waiting. And then, from the darkness of the stage, the puppeteer's voice whispered again, like a breeze passing through cracked walls. "It's time," it said, cold and indifferent, as though it had been waiting for this moment for an eternity. "Time for you to understand." Mary felt the words like a slap to her soul. Understand? What could she possibly understand? She was already lost. She had become part of the cycle, part of the endless performance that trapped her and all the others. There was nothing left for her to know. And yet, that voice, that chilling whisper, pushed her deeper into the unknown. It felt like a command, an invitation, and something in her, some distant flicker of her old self, began to rise within her, urging her to resist, to fight. But even as she tried, she felt her limbs move involuntarily again. The puppet strings dug deeper, more painfully into her flesh. "What is this place?" Mary tried to scream, but the words were swallowed by the thick silence around her, her voice crushed by the weight of the performance. Her throat burned, but she couldn't stop. The puppet inside her continued to move, guiding her in cruel, spiraling motions, as if mocking her every effort. "This is the theater, Mary," the voice responded, dripping with malice. "It is where all things are forgotten, where all things are trapped. It is where the audience becomes part of the show, and the performers never leave." The reality of those words hit her like a wave, crashing over her, threatening to drown her in despair. The audience, the lost souls that filled every seat, their eyes empty yet unblinking, had once been like her. They had once been living, breathing people who had come to see the show, to enjoy a fleeting moment of entertainment. But now they were trapped, just as she was, forever part of this cursed performance. And worse still, they had no voice, no choice. They were locked in place, bound by the same strings that now tied her to this hellish existence. "You think you're special?" The voice hissed again, cold and mocking. "You're just like them, just like the others." The realization settled deep within her, cold and heavy. She had become one of them. The faces in the audience, their hollow expressions, their unmoving bodies, they were no different from her. She had joined the endless cycle. She had become part of the show that never ended. But then, in the heart of the darkness, something stirred. It was a flicker, a weak spark of rebellion. She still remembered, deep down, what it felt like to be free, what it felt like to move without the strings, what it felt like to breathe, to be human. "No!" Mary tried to cry out, her voice finally breaking through the oppressive silence. She wasn't ready to surrender. Not completely. There had to be a way out. There had to be. Her limbs jerked violently, the strings biting deeper into her skin. The puppet of herself, her twisted, lifeless reflection, stood still, as if waiting for her to accept her fate. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Mary could feel something shift inside her. She wasn't entirely lost yet. "You can't escape," the puppeteer's voice mocked her again, louder this time, resonating through her very bones. "There is no freedom for you. There is only the show." But even as the voice taunted her, Mary felt something break. A string, a small, almost imperceptible thread snapped. It was a single thread, but it was enough. Enough to make her remember what it felt like to want something different. And so, for the first time in what felt like forever, she stopped dancing. The audience did not react. They remained still, silent in their seats, their faces frozen in expressions that were impossible to read. The puppets, those poor souls that had once been human, did not move either. They were trapped in their endless cycle, bound by the same strings, the same force that controlled her. But Mary had stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then the strings pulled harder, faster, with a force that made her teeth rattle. Her body lurched, a wave of agony flooding through her. The puppet that was her, that thing that had once been her reflection, moved in unnatural synchronization with her every movement. She could feel her body being twisted and pulled, each motion an assault on her very identity. But she held on to that spark. "You're a part of us now," the voice continued, its tone more guttural, more furious. "You can't fight it. You belong to us." But Mary clenched her fists, though they shook violently from the strain. The puppet that had been her twisted again, but this time it seemed to resist. It was as though the strings could no longer pull her in perfect harmony with its movements. She fought. She fought with everything she had left, everything that was still her. And then, with one final burst of strength, she broke free from the strings, for now. The theater shuddered, its walls creaking as if in pain. The lights flickered, the audience seemed to waver in and out of existence, their faces blurring like smoke in the air. The music stopped altogether, the silence deafening. For a single heartbeat, it felt like she had won, like the cycle had been broken. But deep in her soul, she knew. It was only a matter of time before the show began again. The air in the theater felt thick, suffocating. Mary's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she stood there, surrounded by the cold emptiness of the stage. The strings had snapped, but she could feel their weight still clinging to her, like shadows that refused to fade. Her body trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to her skin. She had broken free, but the victory felt hollow. For a moment, she dared to believe that the worst was over, that she had defied the theater, that she could escape. But as the stillness stretched on, something darker began to stir in the pit of her stomach. The walls, once dark and looming, seemed to pulse with a slow, rhythmic thumping. The lights flickered again, and then, like a sickening symphony, the the sound began to grow louder. The puppets in the audience, the lost souls that had once been like her, did not move. They sat frozen, their faces blank, lifeless. Their eyes, though empty, seemed to follow her every step. And somewhere, deep within the shadows of the stage, the puppeteer's voice echoed again. It was quiet at first, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "You can't escape," it said, its tone dripping with venom. "You can't break the cycle. It will always find you. It will always pull you back." Mary turned, her heart hammering in her chest. The stage was shifting again, its walls bending and twisting as if the theater itself were alive, breathing, waiting for her to make the next move. The floor beneath her feet seemed to ripple, as if it were made of liquid, ready to swallow her whole. The ceiling lowered, the shadows stretching down like fingers, inching closer to her. She could feel it now, the presence of the puppeteer. It was close, too close. The sense of power, of control, was overwhelming. She was no longer just a puppet. She was the center of the show, and it was feeding on her fear. "You're ours now," the voice boomed louder, its authority undeniable. "You can't escape what you've become." A chill ran down her spine as the stage seemed to stretch and contort before her. The audience, those lifeless figures, were no longer the same. Their faces, once blank, were now twisted into grotesque masks of agony. Their eyes, those hollow, empty sockets, glistened with something dark, something hungry. They weren't just watching her. They were waiting for her to return to the performance. They were calling to her. "Join us," the voice whispered again, like a lover's invitation, luring her back into the fold. "You've already danced with us. You're a part of the show now. Forever." Mary felt a tremor in her chest, an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. The strings were still there, pulling at her, even though they weren't physically visible. It was as if they had become part of her soul. The music started again, soft at first, a distant, eerie melody that echoed through the cavernous theater. It was like a lullaby, seductive in its sweetness, but sinister in its intent. The audience's eyes grew wider, their faces twisted in silent screams as they all turned their gaze toward her. Mary wanted to run, wanted to escape, but the music, the song, seemed to wrap itself around her like a shroud, pulling her deeper into the stage, deeper into the performance. "No!" she cried out, her voice trembling, raw with desperation. "I won't be your puppet. I won't." But it was too late. The strings were already pulling her again, invisible threads tightening around her, forcing her to move. Her limbs jerked involuntarily, her body twisting, her movements no longer her own. She could feel the puppet inside her, tugging at her with every movement, taking control of her once again. The performance had begun, and there was no stopping it. She could feel herself slipping, losing the last remnants of who she had been, becoming just another part of the show. She tried to resist, but the force was too strong. The puppet of herself, her twisted, lifeless reflection, spun beside her, mirroring every movement she made. She could feel it, its emotions, its thoughts. It was as if they had become one, two halves of the same wretched being, bound by the same invisible strings. "You are part of us," the voice sang, sweet and cold, like a lullaby from the depths of hell. "You belong here, Mary. This is where you will stay." The stage seemed to stretch and bend, the shadows growing longer and deeper, swallowing everything in their path. The audience, the lost souls, watched in silence, their hollow eyes locked onto her. They were waiting, always waiting. And then the final curtain fell. Or was it just the beginning? The music played on, soft and haunting, as the theater settled into its endless routine. The lights flickered once more, casting long, distorted shadows across the stage. The audience remained motionless, frozen in their seats, trapped in the same cycle of torment. The walls of the theater closed in, the darkness thickening, swallowing everything, until there was only the sound of the music. The show would never end. Not for her. Not for any of them. And as the strings pulled tighter, Mary felt the last fragments of her will break, leaving her only the puppet's empty gaze, the empty smile, and the endless, eternal dance. She was trapped. They all were. Forever. And the show would never stop. The theater was silent once more, but it was a silence pregnant with meaning, heavy, suffocating. The only sound was the faint rustling of the air as it moved through the darkened hall, disturbed by the subtle shifts of the shadows, stretching like hungry fingers across the floor. The lights flickered again, casting their eerie glow over the stage, now devoid of life except for the silent, unmoving figures in the audience. The puppets, and Mary standing, no dancing, in the center of it all. She had lost track of time. How long had it been? Days? Weeks? Months? The concept of time felt foreign here, twisted like everything else in the theater. It was as if she had been pulled into some eternal loop, a place where seconds and hours blended into one endless moment. Her body moved of its own accord now. Her limbs jerked and spun in rhythmic, mechanical patterns that seemed to have no beginning and no end. There was no escape. The strings had her, and they were never going to let her go. Mary! The voice was closer now, more familiar, more insistent. She could feel it vibrating through her very bones, pulling at her insides like the tug of invisible threads. She tried to scream, but no sound came from her lips. It was as though her voice had been stolen, erased from her existence. She was nothing but a marionette, her thoughts and will drowned out by the sound of the music that flowed like cold water through her mind. "You belong to us now," the voice whispered again, so soft it might have been a caress if it weren't so chilling. "We are one. You will never leave. You will always perform." Mary's heart, a thing she wasn't sure she still had, seemed to stop, and yet she kept moving, her body obeying the pull of the invisible strings. Her movements had become fluid, perfect, as if they were no longer hers at all. She was a puppet, yes, but also something worse, a reflection, a shell of a person trapped within itself. And then, without warning, she stopped. For a moment, the stage was still. The lights flickered again, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts across the walls, and the audience, those poor, lifeless souls, began to stir. Slowly, their faces twisted into expressions of pain, their eyes rolling back in their sockets. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like the slow movements of the dead. It wasn't just the puppets who had been trapped in this endless cycle. It was everyone. "Help me," Mary whispered, the words breaking through the silence, but only in her mind. "Please, help me." But no one answered. There was no one to help. There was only the show, the endless, cruel show that kept repeating itself, every second an echo of the last. And then, as if to mock her, the voice returned, this time louder, more demanding. "Join us," it commanded. "You will never be free. You will never escape." A cold chill ran down her spine. Mary tried to move, tried to fight the invisible strings, but her body wouldn't obey. Her limbs felt heavy, like they were filled with lead, and every movement was a battle against the pull of the puppet master. The strings tightened, digging into her flesh, and she could feel her skin tear, but still she moved. She had no choice. Then, through the haze of her fear and confusion, something shifted. Something small but undeniable. The audience, those vacant figures, were no longer just watching. They were shifting, slowly, steadily, their heads tilted. One by one, their faces began to twist, their lips curling into grotesque smiles, their eyes locked onto Mary, their expressions twisted with a maddening hunger. The sound of their breath, ragged and shallow, filled the room. It was as if they were no longer trapped in their seats, no longer passive observers. No, they had become something else. Hungry things, creatures born from the same curse that had brought Mary here. They were waiting for her to complete the cycle, to take her place among them, to join them in their twisted, eternal performance. "No!" Mary screamed in her mind, though her mouth would not move. "I won't." But the music had started again, a slow, crawling melody that dripped like poison into her soul. The puppets in the audience began to rise, their movements jerky, awkward, but determined. They were coming for her. "We are all part of the show now," the voice sang, its tone sweet and cruel. "There is no end to it, Mary. No beginning. Only the performance. And you are the star." Mary wanted to run. She wanted to break free, to escape the stage and the horrors that lurked in the darkness beyond it. But the strings pulled tighter. She was trapped. No matter how much she fought, no matter how much she screamed in her mind, she could not escape. The performance was always going to be the same. The audience would always return. And the puppeteer, whoever or whatever it was, would always pull the strings. She was the star of the show. But what kind of star could she be if she had no choice but to play her part? The puppets were getting closer now, their jerky, mechanical movements drawing them toward her. Their eyes were empty, their mouths frozen in grotesque, silent screams. She could feel them, feel their hunger, their need for her to join them. They wanted her. They wanted her to become one of them, to become another puppet, another soul trapped in the endless cycle. But Mary, what was left of Mary, refused. She would not let them win. She would not let the puppeteer take her completely. In a final, desperate act, she slammed her foot down hard on the stage floor, and for a brief moment, the music stopped. The theater seemed to hold its breath. The audience paused. The strings, for a brief moment, relaxed. Mary's chest heaved as she stood there, staring at the now-still faces of the puppets, their blank eyes locked onto her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was truly still. The silence was deafening. She could hear the faint sound of her own breathing, the thud of her heart in her chest. And then, without warning, the walls of the theater began to pulse again, the strings tightening once more, the shadows stretching like claws. The show was not over. It would never be over. The cycle continued. The sound of the strings tightening echoed through the theater, sharp and relentless. Mary's body jerked involuntarily, her limbs moving like clockwork as the strings pulled her into another sequence. Her mind screamed, but her body obeyed, her feet moving across the stage, her arms lifting and falling, mirroring the same movements she had made before, over and over again. The lights flickered, casting long, terrifying shadows over the stage, and for a moment, she thought she saw something beyond the darkness, a flicker of movement, something that shouldn't be there, something that watched. The audience was no longer just silent, their eyes now gleaming with something darker, something more alive. The puppets, they were moving, yes, but not in the way they had before. They were twitching, their heads jerking at odd angles, their bodies trembling with an energy that had not been there before. They were watching her, not with empty, lifeless eyes anymore, but with a look of recognition, of hunger. And they were hungry for more than just the performance. They were hungry for her. Mary could feel it, could feel their cold, unseen fingers creeping closer, their presence tightening around her like a noose. She had been part of the show before, but now it was different. The show was consuming her, taking pieces of her soul, one performance at a time, until there would be nothing left but the puppet. Why are you doing this?" Mary's voice cracked through the silence, though it wasn't really her voice at all. It was a hollow echo, barely more than a whisper, but it still rang through the theater. Her words were absorbed into the walls, swallowed by the shadows that clung to the edges of the stage. "Because you were meant to be here," the voice of the puppeteer answered, more tangible now, its presence suffocating. "You were always meant to be a part of the performance, Mary. All of you are. All the ones who came before you, the ones who will come after, you are all mine. Forever." A shiver ran down her spine as the realization hit her. She wasn't just performing for an audience. The puppets, the audience, they were the same. They were the ones who had been pulled into the theater, transformed into the same twisted, lifeless creatures that filled the seats. They were the remnants of past performances, and now, they were the ones who would drag her down into the same dark, eternal cycle. The strings pulled tighter, and Mary felt herself spinning once more, her movements jerky, unnatural, but synchronized with the others. Her feet shuffled across the stage, her arms rising and falling, mimicking the same performance over and over. She could feel her body being stretched to its breaking point, the strings cutting into her skin like knives. But still she could not stop. "Join us," the voice whispered again, its tone soft and insistent. "You are part of the show now, Mary. You will never leave. You will never escape." The puppets began to rise from their seats, their movements slow and stiff, like marionettes on strings too tight to move freely. But their eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, were locked on her, and there was a sinister hunger in them now. They weren't just waiting for her performance. They were waiting for her to become a part of the performance. As the last of the audience members stood, Mary's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel the pull of the strings, the weight of the stage beneath her feet, the pressure building, suffocating her. She was trapped in the performance, but not just any performance. This was the one that would complete the cycle. This was the moment she would become the puppet. She could feel the cold, unnatural presence of the theater closing in around her, and the walls seemed to shrink with every passing second, pressing in on her like a vice. "You can't fight it," the voice murmured, its tone like a twisted lullaby. "You belong to the show now. You are ours." Mary fought against the pull, fought against the strings that yanked her body in every direction, but it was no use. Her body was no longer her own. She could feel the puppet master's control tightening around her, could feel herself slipping away, becoming something else. The pain in her limbs was sharp, but it was fading, like an afterthought, as her thoughts became clouded, hazy. The more she struggled, the more she lost of herself. But there was a small part of her, deep inside, that refused to give in. In a moment of clarity, as the music swelled to a deafening crescendo, Mary did the unthinkable. She stopped. The strings, for a split second, faltered. Her body was still, frozen in place. The puppets had stopped moving. The audience was motionless, their eyes fixed on her, waiting. The music came to an abrupt halt, the silence deafening in its wake. She could feel the weight of their gaze, the hunger in their eyes, and for the first time, she didn't move. She resisted, and then it happened. The walls of the theater seemed to shudder, as if the entire building were coming to life. The shadows stretched and recoiled, like a living thing, and the air grew thick with something dark, something ancient. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, the very foundations of the theater rattling. The puppets, those twisted, lifeless figures, began to twitch once more, their bodies jerking and convulsing as if they were struggling against some invisible force. The stage was shaking, and the once rigid strings seemed to snap, breaking apart like brittle thread. The air smelled of dust and decay, and yet there was a strange, sickly sweetness to it, like the perfume of death itself. The theater was alive with the struggle of its prisoners, its creations, fighting against the dark force that had bound them here for so long. Mary's body trembled as she stood, frozen in place, but the pull of the strings, the force of the puppeteer's will, was weakening. She could feel it, like a thread unraveling deep inside her, slowly loosening its grip. She wasn't free yet, but the struggle had shifted. The walls, no, the entire theater, was rebelling against its creator. The stage was alive, and it was breaking apart. The strings that held her, that held all of them, were snapping one by one, and the silence that followed was the calm before the storm. And then, with a deafening roar, the theater's walls exploded in a burst of dust and splinters, sending shards flying into the air, the darkness flooding into the broken space. The puppets fell to the floor, their forms crumbling into nothing more than twisted remnants of wood and fabric. The stage trembled and groaned, but the music was gone. The voices of the puppets, the puppeteer's command, it all disappeared into the silence. Mary collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. She was free. Mary's breath came in ragged gasps as she stared into the ruin of the theater. The broken walls groaned like a dying creature, splinters and shattered beams scattered across the floor in chaotic heaps. The once lively atmosphere had turned into a hollow void, the air heavy with the smell of decay and destruction. The flickering lights had gone out completely, plunging the theater into an almost suffocating darkness. She could hear nothing now but the sound of her own heartbeat, thumping loudly in her ears, and the distant creak of the old structure settling. But something still lingered in the air, a sense that she wasn't truly alone. The shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor, twisting like writhing tendrils, and every movement seemed to echo in the emptiness. Mary slowly rose to her feet, her legs shaky and weak, as if they had forgotten what it was like to move freely. Her eyes scanned the broken remnants of the theater, but there was no sign of the puppets, no sign of the audience. The stage, once a place of twisted performances, was now a desolate pit of debris and decay. Yet, a faint whisper seemed to linger in the air, soft but unmistakable. It wasn't words exactly, but something more, unsettling, like a memory brushing against her skin. "You're not free," a voice murmured, distant yet somehow right there, as though it had always been present, just beneath the surface of her thoughts. Not yet. Mary's heart skipped a beat. She spun around, but the theater remained empty, save for the wreckage. She took a cautious step forward, then another, her eyes darting in every direction, looking for the source of the voice. But the theater remained silent. "You can't escape what you've become," the voice whispered again, and this time Mary recognized it. It was the puppeteer's voice, the one that had controlled her, the one that had haunted her every step. But it wasn't coming from anywhere. It seemed to be coming from within her, as though it had burrowed into her very soul. "The show never ends, Mary. You belong to me. You always will." Mary's pulse quickened, panic rising in her chest as she staggered backward. The theater had fallen apart, yes, but the voice, the presence, was still here, and it was still inside her. She could feel it, gnawing at her thoughts, infecting her mind with its chilling insistence. "You can never escape." She clutched her head, her fingers digging into her scalp as if trying to hold herself together. She couldn't escape. No matter how much she fought, how much she tried to resist, the puppeteer had already claimed her. Her body might have been freed from the strings, but her soul, her mind, it was still trapped. The theater had fallen to ruin, yes, but the curse? It lived on, and it wasn't done with her yet. "I won't let you take me again," Mary said aloud, her voice hoarse but determined. "I won't be your puppet anymore." For a moment, the theater seemed to hold its breath, and then the whispering stopped. A cold, unnerving silence fell over the room, and the shadows seemed to tighten, pressing in on her from all sides. The temperature dropped, and Mary shivered, her skin crawling with an unnatural chill. She closed her eyes, trying to gather what little strength she had left. There had to be a way to end this. There had to be a way to break free for good. When she opened her eyes again, she wasn't alone. The figures were there, standing in the darkness, their forms barely visible but unmistakable. The puppets, the audience, the creatures that had once sat in those seats, their souls long since absorbed into the theater. They were standing now, watching her with their vacant eyes, their twisted, contorted bodies shifting with unnatural movements. They were waiting. "No," Mary whispered, backing away. She couldn't fight them. Not like this. There were too many of them, too many remnants of past performances. And the theater wasn't done with her. It was pulling her back, pulling her into the cycle once more. The figures moved toward her slowly, their limbs jerking in time with the haunting rhythm of the unseen strings. Their hollow eyes followed her every movement. She could hear them breathing, their slow, shallow breaths filling the space around her like a suffocating fog. The closer they got, the more she could see their faces, twisted and broken, their features warped by time and rot. These were not people anymore, they were something else. Something far worse. "You belong to us," one of the figures muttered, its voice rasping like dry leaves in the wind. "You will join the performance. It's what you were meant to do." Mary's throat constricted, and she stumbled backward, her hands reaching for something, anything, to defend herself. But the darkness seemed to press in tighter, and the air was thick with their presence, suffocating her. The theater had consumed them, twisted them into these monstrous forms, and now they were coming for her. Her back hit the cold, crumbling wall, and she froze, trapped between the advancing figures and the dark abyss beyond. The puppets were nearly upon her now, their eyes glowing faintly, their mouths twitching in grotesque imitation of a smile. "No!" Mary screamed, her voice breaking through the silence as she reached deep within herself, clawing for any strength she could find. "I won't be part of this." And then, in that moment of desperation, something inside her snapped. She couldn't say how or why, but something deep within the wreckage of her mind fought back. There was a sudden, overwhelming rush of energy, cold and bitter, like the very essence of the theater's curse was flowing through her. The walls of the theater began to tremble again, shaking with the intensity of her defiance. The floor cracked beneath her feet, and a sharp, deafening sound filled the air, the sound of something tearing, something breaking wide open. The strings that had held her captive, snapped one by one, and with each break, the theater seemed to unravel further. The shadows recoiled, the figures that had once been the audience faltered, their movements slowed as if they were struggling to stay together. The whispers, those terrible, twisting whispers, faded, growing quieter, weaker. The puppets were still advancing, but now their forms were flickering, like broken images, like fading dreams. "You can't stop it," one of them rasped, its voice cracking. "It's in you. You'll never be free." But Mary stood tall, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling with each desperate breath. She could feel the theater's hold on her loosening, could feel the weight of the curse lifting, piece by piece. She wasn't just fighting anymore, she was breaking free. "I am not your puppet," she said, her voice stronger now, unwavering. "And I will never be part of your show." The final string snapped, and with that, the darkness shattered. The theater was gone. The cursed performance was over, and Mary was free. She stood in the ruins of the theater, the last remnants of the twisted cycle fading into nothing. The air was still, the silence deep. The voices had gone. The puppets were no more. Mary was no longer trapped in the theater. She had broken the cycle, for good. But as she turned to leave the remnants of the dark stage behind, she couldn't shake the feeling that the theater wasn't done with her. It had only waited. As Mary stepped away from the ruined theater, the once oppressive air seemed to lift, though the weight of what had happened lingered in her chest. The crumbling walls behind her groaned, their timbers sighing like an old, dying creature. The darkness that had clung to the place was now retreating, but something cold and unsettling gnawed at her insides. She had escaped the nightmare, or so she thought. The village lay silent before her, bathed in an eerie quiet. The streets, once bustling with the shadows of the audience, were now empty. The theater was gone, its presence wiped from existence as though it had never been there. But Mary knew better. The memories were carved into her very soul. As she walked, she thought she heard soft, distant footsteps echoing behind her. When she turned, there was no one there, just the empty, abandoned road. "It's not over," she whispered to herself, though the words felt foreign. She could still feel the lingering sensation of strings, the weight of the puppeteer's gaze, haunting her thoughts. With every step she took, the village seemed to grow quieter. No birds sang, no wind stirred the trees. The world felt still, unnaturally still. The night sky above was clear, yet the stars seemed to fade in and out, as if something was distorting the very fabric of reality. As she reached the edge of the village, she paused, staring into the open field ahead. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, just slightly, as if something deep below was waking. Her breath hitched as she glanced over her shoulder, and there, in the distance, the faintest outline of the puppet theater appeared once more. Its silhouette flickered against the moonlit sky. She blinked, and it was gone. I am not your puppet, Mary repeated softly, her voice stronger now, though it trembled with doubt. She wanted to believe it. She needed to believe it. But as she walked into the night, the echo of distant laughter, soft like a faint memory, followed her, trailing her every step. And somewhere, in the dark shadows of the village, unseen by her eyes, a pair of puppet strings danced in the wind. As the fog settles and the whispers fade, keep listening to the sound of rain. Let it wash over you and drift into a deep, peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.